Evening, folks. This old Buster coming to you again. I got my hat, want a new hat here. One of these old boys down there at John Deere. Ain't nothing runs like a deer. This comes out of Yellow House Machinery. They got 10 locations down there in Texas and Oklahoma. And old Dean Key and them boys down there, they take care of us pretty good. Always helping us out. Well, then we got another place we go to eat some good barbecue, and that's so famous Dave's here. That gum, if they didn't give me some real good bread pudding the other night. Just wanted to tell you folks that. If you got time to go by and visit them folks, they'd sure enough appreciate it. Well, we got a new story here I wrote not long ago called Trompin Cotton. Well, Gwan T. Jackson hunted up Buster early of a morning and told him Mr. Anderson over at the gin wanted to see him if and the boys and any of their friends wanted to tromp cotton for a few days. Well, Buster said he'd see if and the boys had done their chores and if their maws and paws could spare them, and would call up Mr. Anderson in a bit. Well, Buster went over to the leak soda fountain and used the party line phone to do his calling. Well, first off, he called Hired, then Walter, then Jesse. Well, they all hollered out to their ma and pa when he called, and they said they could get by there for a bit there for the weekend, saying how they was all laid by. Well, next off, Buster called the Fernie Ho and the Pole boy triplets and Brenniger and the Jones boys, along with Goober Uber and the Black boys. They all allowed they would help out, and they dearly wanted the hard cash to spend at the state fair coming up. Well, Buster called up Mr. Anderson and told him he had his himself a crew, and they'd be glad to help on out. Well, about that time, Big Mike Young and Shiner and Tap wandered in to Leaks, and Buster told them that what all was going on, asked them if they could spare a few days. Well, they said sure enough they could and would meet Buster over to the gin after dinner. Well, all the boys met up at the gin after dinner around about 1 o'clock. Well, Mr. Anderson told all the boys that he was in a pickle and sure enough needed their help. He said Buster would head up the crew and assign each of the boys a trailer to be tromped. Mr. Anderson allowed he could give each of them a $20 gold piece for the work to be done. All the cotton crops was bumper that year, and trailers was stacking up something fierce. Well, he said he appreciated the boys coming over so quick and then left them at it. Well, Buster confabbed with the boys and told them all how they ought to be paired up. He wanted each one of the Po boys and Goober to be in a trailer, and he would take one his himself as well as Walter, saying how they done this before. Big Mike would have his and brothers, Shiner and Tap. Well, Buster says how all the boys ought to be knowing what they're doing. If they didn't, they needed some help. They kind of learned them a little bit there. Said all you got to do is tromp the cotton in the trailer as flat as a flitter as you can. Then go to another. I sure as the devil hope we can get the trailers in the yard up to the suck pipe before the weekend is up. Well, about that time, big boy Billy Kane Bailey come up and said he heard Buster needed some help for the weekend and would be more than glad to lend a hand. Well, Buster said that he sure enough appreciated his help, but as skinny as he was, he probably needs somebody to help tromp that cotton. Well, anyway, he'd round out the crew and he appreciated him coming on by. Well, Buster told him what the pay was and what he wanted to get done before the weekend was over. Now here's how I want to set it up, says Buster. Well, Big Mike and his and brothers, Shiner and Tap, they had a trailer. Goober with Furnuckle and Carbuncle Jones had another trailer. Cousin Bell, Poe with Festus, Fernie Ho, and Alabat Bat had him a trailer. Huzzabell Poe and Firkus Fernie Ho and Miralat Bat had him a trailer. Now Matuzabell, which is a Poe, with Furl Fernie Ho and Herschel Blatt, they had him one. And Walter with Brenniger and big boy Billy Kane Bailey. Now Buster had Hired Jesse. Well, each of the three-man groups of boys went into them trailers just a tromping. Well, Buster ambled on over to Big Mike and told him if and he'd got behind to let him know and he would come on and take up the slack. He knowed Shiner and Tap was a mite younger than the rest of the boys and might get plumb tuckered out. Big Mike said not to worry none, they'd do their part. Well, he knew they would too. That Big Mike, he don't let no grass grow under that boy's feet, I tell you. Well, that afternoon coming on supper time, Mr. Anderson come by and told all the boys they was doing a really fine job and getting the trailers in real fast. He figured all the boys was hungry and fixed it so they could all eat at Fisher's Cafe and stay the night over at Ms. White's boarding house. Well, Mr. Anderson told the boys he done spoke to all their folks, and they all agreed it was best for him to stay over. Now, boys, y'all got to rise and shine and be at it at daylight. Don't want to burn none. So eat your fill and get some rest. Well, this was a high old adventure for all the boys, especially for the youngins. Shiner and Tap come up to Buster and says that they would do their part not to worry none about them. Buster just grinned and said he knowed they would, and if they was anything like Big Mike and their paw, he sure didn't have no worries. The next morning, while stepping out with the suck pipe for a spell, relieving Jonas Barnes so he could go to the outhouse, Buster seen one of the hands toting 2 bales of cotton on a cart to be stored at the warehouse. The feller got snagged on the gin floor and was trying to keep the bales from falling off the cart and onto him. Well, he just didn't have the stout to do that, and one of the bales began to tip over on the feller. About that time, Buster seed his and friend Chinch run over and grabbed that there bale and lifted it back on the cart. Now, you gotta know that bale of cotton weighs near about 500 pounds or better. That Tinch was some kind of man. Just born cornbread stout, I reckon, just like Buster. Well, the boys started in on Thursday afternoon and stayed late on Saturday, near about 8 o'clock. Well, Sunday morning, Buster reported in to Mr. Anderson that they was done and asked him if he needed anything else done. Well, Mr. Anderson said he didn't rightly know how they got done so fast, but they done one whale of a good job and finished up quicker than he thought. Well, Mr. Anderson told Buster he put together a heck of a good crew and he was a dang good ramrod. Well, all them boys is workers, said Buster. Well, Mr. Anderson give Buster a pouch of $20 gold pieces for the boys with a little something extra for Buster. Said they was the best labor he ever had and all, and had a job if and they ever wanted one, each and every one of them. By the way, I was told that you not only tromp cotton, but worked the suck pipe and lent a hand at the other chores as well in the gin, said Mr. Anderson. I am right proud of y'all, and I am going to see your Grandpa Gus and tell him so, Buster. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Now we all is going to go get ready for the state fair, says Buster. Well, have a good time, said Mr. Anderson. Well, Buster left on out and met the boys out there at Leak Soda Fountain and paid them all off and bought all the eats and ice cream for them all. Well, Buster told them it was on Mr. Anderson, and he said to tell them all they done one heck of a good job. Well, all the boys said goodbye and said they'd meet up at the state fair. Well, Buster hired Jesse and Walter, stayed behind to palaver a bit before they left on out. You know, we got enough to go to the state fair and take a little trip. What say we go to Aunt Gertrude's and see old Buck Passer and take y'all to see a real live horse race, said Buster. We got the invite for us all and hired Walter ain't never seen the like. Jesse sure enough was in favor of that and said, let's get to cracking. Now you know that Buster took that little extra money from Mr. Anderson and bought everything for them boys to eat at Soda Fountain and whatnot. Ain't no way he's gonna take more than them. Well, all the boys went to Little Rock to the state fair at the fairgrounds and seed all the other boys there too. Buster went to the bell ringing first off and won himself a dang stuffed bear. Well, Walter was a tossing rings on the bottles and done right well too, winning the stuffed frog. Well, Howard was a chunking baseball at some kind of stuffed dolls on his second try and figured out what it took to knock him down and won himself a stuffed monkey. Well, Jesse said he wasn't going to spend his hard-earned cash on no games, so he just went to gomming around looking at everything. Well, after the boys got done playing games, they went to riding rides. The roller coaster was sure enough a hoot. Then the boys went to eating everything they took a fancy to. Well, after all the munching and all the fair delights, the boys sidled on over to the livestock judging and then to the Hall of Industry, the Arkansas building and the Farm and Ranch building, and finally on to the rodeo in the arena in the evening. The boys was having a high old time. Even if it was getting late, they decided to ride the Ferris wheel to see all the sights. The ride was lots of fun, but after a couple of rounds, the dang thing stopped dead in its tracks. The boys were sure enough in luck, as they was on the bottom of it. Folks was all the way to the top, stuck there. Folks was a hollering, and kids was a crying, and gals just a screaming. Well, the boys jumped on out of their seats and run up to the operator, and he said it appeared to him that something got caught in the cogs and overheated the motor. Walter said some folks was in dire straits and just had to get on down, but it would be a spell before help could get to them. So he grabbed a rope used for the rigging and a lariat off a horse riding by and headed up to the trailer. Well, then Walter began to climbing on top of that there Ferris wheel. You know, the boy, he never was scared of heights, you know. He weren't scared of no heights at all. Buster hollered after him and told him to let him know what all he wanted him to do when he got to the folks that needed his help. When Walter got to the people, he rigged them up to be lowered to the ground and hollered down to Buster to anchor the rope long with hired. When I tell you, he hollered down, lower them slow like. Well, Buster said, we ain't going to drop them down, doggone it. Walter told Jesse to climb a ways up and to steady the rope from swaying. Now, you know, Jesse don't like no heights, but he knew they had to save them folks. The boys got near about 12 folks down from the top before the rescue team from the Little Rock Fire Department got there. Some folks had the vapors, and some was in shock, and some near about had a heart attack. The boys let on out of there when Walter slid down the rope to the ground as folks was a-clapping. They made it out to Buster's Ford and made tracks for the King Biscuit Blues Festival outside of Helena. Well, you know that's where Conway Twitty was. Well, of course, his real name Harold Jenkins, you know. The boys spent the night along the way and then made their way on down to Helena and enjoyed the good barbecue and other good eats to be had from vendors from all over the South down there. The blues was a-playing all day and night. Buster seed an old boy he knowed from down Pine Bluff round about Dollar Way, Whitehall, Watson Chapel Way, about all three of them right together, you know, and McFadden Road. Well, all of them joined up thereabout. That's how they are down there. Old boy's name was Larry Simpson. And could that boy pick a grin? That's pick and grin. Heck of a singer and a songwriter, and he was a-playing with some of his friends there at the festival. Well, Larry was a heck of a country singer and made a name for himself in the music business. They seen lots of other folks they knowed there too. There was a like of Harold Jenkins, you know, that's Conway Twitty, and Jim Ed Brown, and Doyle Nelson, and Jimmy Martin, along with Ron Stone, Ron Jordan, and Billy Joe Bagwell. Elvis and Jerry Lee was there too, and they made the crowd go plumb wild. Well, the boys sure enough enjoyed themselves, and everybody told them not to make themselves a stranger and come visit when they could. The boys had brung along a supply of Old McBrayer and passed out a bottle to each of their friends. The boys hadn't thought to be gone for too long, so they lit out early the next morning to Kentucky by way of Highway 49 to Mississippi to Jeffries Road to Highway 61 to Memphis. Boy, they didn't have no freeways then. The boys drove up to Nashville and was about to make that turn towards Lexington when they see the familiar truck and trailer. Danged if and it wasn't Big Mike Young a-making his way back from seeing some of his kin in North Carolina with his horse Ebony in tow. The boys crossed over to see if they could help and found that he done broke down and it was going to take 2 weeks at least to get the parts for his old Dodge truck. Well, Buster told Big Mike he was going to go with them and they would pick up his truck after their visit to the horse races. They latched on to the trailer and took Ebony with them. There'd be plenty of pasture firm where they was a-going, and Big Mike would have the time of his life. He might as well make the best of it and just call his folks and let them know he was with them and he'd be home soon. Well, the boys drove on for a spell and found a good place to bed down for the night for them and old Ebony. The next day they made it through to Lexington and on to Paris, where Aunt Gertrude and Uncle Melvin met them with open arms. What a feed she put on for them boys. Man alive, there was more than a body could eat for sure. And now, of course, Buster could eat his weight in it, you know. Being as it was on the fall of the year, harvest give them every kind of vegetable you could imagine, and all them fried pork chops and fried chicken to boot, and dumplings too. Well, Buster plumb cleaned out all them pan-fried taters, that's for sure. Won't even talk about the pie. Buster done eat 2 sweet tater pies himself and half a dozen of them fried peach pies. Well, old Ebony was in hog heaven as well. Plenty of pasture and grain and water. Best water a critter could get. Well, Ebony and Buckpasser met up the next morning, and everybody was expecting to see the worst from them 2 stallions. But after getting to know each other over across the fence, they seemed to get along right well. Well, Aunt Gertrude called all the boys' folks and told them they made it just fine, and she'd have her nephew Roscoe, of course that's Buster's uncle, check on Big Mike's truck and let him know when it was ready. He had a wrecker in a garage, and he'd see to it that it was getting fixed right, him back on his way with Buster and the boys when they left out. Well, the next day the boys called over to see if Mr. Ogden Phelps and Mr. Bill Winifred, Buckpasser's owner and trainer, was around. Sure enough, they was, and they invited all the boys over to dinner and to visit. Now, you folks don't rightly know. You want to say dinner is supper, but it ain't. Dinner is high noon and supper's at night. That's what we call it, so don't y'all get all fretting over that. If you want to be like you are in Yankee Land, that's fine, but that ain't how we do it down south. There was hot brown and brown Betty served for 'em along with sweet iced tea. The meal was famous and was as good as it was known to be. The boys toured Claiborne Farms and visited old Buckpasser again, and Buster and Jesse give him his sugar cube and an apple. That horse dearly loves them sugar cubes and apples. While visiting, Buster was a-telling about meeting up with Big Mike and his and Walker. Well, Ebony, that was across the fence from Buckpasser, they done met up, getting along right well. They told Mr. Phelps and Mr. Winifred it was the sight to see them 2 horses nose to nose. Y'all sure enough be a kiddin', they said. Buckpasser don't get along with no of the stallions. He'll fight 'em. Well, they ain't a-fighting, says Big Mike. Why don't y'all mosey on over tomorrow, and if you can, and we'll show you. Well, we'll do just that. About 10 a.m., 10 o'clock. We'll be a-waiting, said Jesse. Well, I spoke up and said to them all, I've been about with every kind of critter there is, and I got away with them. We will just see how all this plays out. I got an ID why this is, he said. Well, scratched my head a little bit on that. On the way out, Jesse gave Mr. Phelps and Mr. Winifred 2 quart bottles of Old McBrayer each. He told them his and great-grandpa made it. Well, them 2 men just couldn't believe their eyes, I'm telling you. Got bigger than the dadgum pie plate. Well, Mr. Phelps said to Jesse, don't you know how much this whiskey's worth? Not as much as your friendship, he said. Well, all the boys thanked Mr. Phelps and Mr. Winifred for their hospitality and told them it was really good to see them again. They'd visit again tomorrow. Well, both Mr. Phelps and Mr. Winifred come on by about 10 a.m. The boys was waiting at the fence with both horses, one on each side of the fence. Now, I've seen a lot of things with horses, but nothing like them 2 stallions getting along like they're doing, said Mr. Winifred. Mr. Phelps seconded that for sure. Well, Howard said his an ID that Buckpasser never was around any horses except for stud purposes and was just plumb lonely. They is herd animals, you know, and it ain't natural for 'em being by themselves. Well, Mr. Phelps said to open the gate and let's see what happens. Mr. Winifred spoke up, said, you know what it would cost if anything happened to old Buckpasser, don't you? His stud fees is up there. Sure enough, but I feel like old Buckpasser has more than paid his and dues, and I think it's worth a try. Well, Big Mike did the honors and opened the gate and let them 2 horses meet up on their own. Them 2 horses nuzzled and rubbed cheeks and necks and just took off a running then, and a kicking up their heels and a frolicking like they was colts. They run from one pasture to the other and then run to the fence looking for the boys to give them a treat of a sugar cube, apple or a carrot, then took off again and then went to a grazing. Dangest thing I ever did see, said Mr. Phelps. If you ever want a job, I got one for you. Well, any of them boys could do that, you know. Mr. Phelps then asked Big Mike if his Ebony was papered, and he said he was a purebred Tennessee walker, and he raised him from a colt. Well, Big Mike whistled for Ebony, and he run over to Big Mike, and he mounted him bareback and told old Ebony to strut his and stuff. What a sight to see Big Mike put him through his and paces. Every which a gait a show walker was supposed to do, and then some. Well, both men was in pure awe with their eyes bugged out and jaws a-flapping, I tell you. Well, Mr. Phelps said he'd be back in a bit. Well, Aunt Gertrude done put out a lunch for everybody, and Mr. Phelps said he would be back for it. Said he wasn't going to miss what all Gertrude cooked up, that's for sure. Wasn't long before Mr. Phelps come on back, and they sit on down at the dinner table like they was all family and was just a-visiting. Well, Mr. Phelps asked Uncle Belvin how his tobacco crop did this year at auction, and Uncle Belvin said he got top dollar. Well, Mr. Winifred said that was as usual because he was known to grow the best. Well, after dinner and pecan pie and homemade ice cream, Mr. Phelps asked if and Big Mike would like to take Ebony to a little horse show for Tennessee walkers. Big Mike said he ain't ever been in a horse show before, ain't never seen one. Well, if and you and everybody would like to go, Mr. Winifred and I will help you and just see how good Ebony is. You won't have to pay no entry fee, and we'll trailer him for you, and not a nary bit of nothing else. Sounds like fun, so I don't reckon we can turn down an offer like that, said Big Mike. You boys be over to the farm tomorrow morning, meet up with Mr. Winifred, and he will get y'all all fixed up. We'll just leave the gate open, and you can call up Ebony when Mr. Winifred is ready for him. Well, the next morning, Big Mike gathered up his and tack, and they took off to Claiborne Farms. Well, Mr. Winifred met them and took Big Mike in and said for him to pick out a saddle he thought that'd fit him. Now, Big Mike ain't no little fella neither now. Well, Big Mike was plumb goggle-eyed. One of the stable boys helped Big Mike get outfitted and then took him to a room with all manner of clothes and boots. Well, Big Mike got all gussied up, and then Mr. Winifred had Big Mike to call up Ebony. Ebony come up, and they got him saddled up and all, and then Big Mike mounted him. He rode him around the paddock and a bit to get used to their new duds gear. Well, Mr. Winifred asked Big Mike to show him all the gaits Ebony could do. Turned out he could do them all, both with the flat shod plantation pleasure and park pleasure. Now, Big Mike didn't know all the fancy names, but he seed all the gaits in the book and trained Ebony in all of them since he was a colt. Now, Mr. Winifred showed Big Mike how he would have to ride and show Ebony, and Big Mike took to it right off. Now, the boys was plumb bumfuzzled by it all, so Mr. Winifred told about how it was to be done. This show was governed by the National Walking Horse Association and the United States Equestrian Federation. The Tennessee walking horse is best known for its running walk. This is a 4-beat gait with the same footfall pattern as a regular or flat walk, but significantly faster. Well, now, Mr. Winifred went on to tell us boys something else, so I'm going to read it to you. While a horse is performing flat walk moves at 4 to 8 miles per hour, 6.4 to 12.9 kilometers per hour, that's that fancy talk, metric stuff, the running walk allows the same horse to travel 10 to 20 miles an hour. In the running walk, the horse's rear feet overstep the prints of its front feet by 6 to 18 inches, with a longer overstep being more prized in the Tennessee walking horse breed. While performing the running walk, the horse nods its head in rhythm with its gait. Besides the flat and running walks, the third main gait performed by Tennessee walking horse is the canter. Some members of the breed perform other variations of lateral ambling gaits, including the rack, stepping pace, foxtrot, single foot, which are allowable for pleasure riding, but penalized in the show ring. A few Tennessee walking horses can trot and have a long and reaching stride. Well, that's a lot to remember, said Big Mike. I'm going to get you down in there and you'll make it all right, said Mr. Winifred. Let me go on and tell you about it. The two basic categories of Tennessee walking horse competition are called flat shod and performance. Now, flat shod horses compete in many different disciplines under both Western and English tack. At shows where both divisions are offered, the flat shod plantation pleasure division is judged on brilliance and show presence of the horses while still being well-mannered, balanced, and manageable. Park pleasure is the most animated of the flat shod divisions. Flat-shod horses are known and shown in ordinary horseshoes and are not allowed to use pads or action devices, though their hooves are sometimes trimmed to a slightly lower angle with more natural toe than seen on stock horse breeds. Now, performance horses, sometimes called padded or built up, exhibit flashy and animated gaits, lifting their forelegs high off the ground with each step. Now, this exaggerated action is sometimes called the big lick. Now, us boys have kind of heard that. The customary style for rider attire and tack is saddle seat. Horses are shod in double and triple nailed pads, which are sometimes called stacks. Now, this form of shoeing is prohibited at shows governed by the National Walking Horse Association and the United States Equestrian Federation. Horses in Western classes wear equipment similar to that used by other breeds in Western pleasure classes, and exhibitors may not mix English and Western style equipment. Riders must wear a hat or a helmet in Western classes. Tennessee walkers are also shown in both pleasure and fine harness driving classes with grooming similar to the saddle seat horses. Tennessee walking horses are typically shown with a long mane and tail. Artificially set tails are seen in performance classes on full-grown horses in halter classes and in some harness classes, but generally are not allowed in pleasure and flat-shod competition. In classes where horses are turned out in saddle seat equipment, it is typical for the horse to be shown in single curb bit with a bit shank under 5.5 inches, rather than the double bridle more common to other saddle seat breeds. Riders wear typical saddle seat attire. Hats are not always mandatory, but use of safety helmets is allowed and ranges from strongly encouraged to required in some pleasure division classes. Woo-wee! Well, Mr. Winifred said he thought Big Mike ought to enter flat-shod competition and see how he does. Going to be quite interesting. Well, Big Mike said, I don't rightly know if I can remember all that right now. Well, the boys watched Mr. Winifred coach Big Mike and Ebony all afternoon and the next day. Well, then they was off that Saturday to Lexington for the show. Big Mike said he was beginning to get the hang of it, and Ebony's doing real well. Well, Mr. Phelps and his family and Aunt Gertrude and Uncle Melvin come along with the boys. They said it was real exciting like. Well, Uncle Melvin told Big Mike no matter what happened to just have some fun and not to worry if he won or lost. Now, all the boys and him and Aunt Gertrude was right proud of him, especially with Mr. Phelps taking him under his wing and his first time showing Ebony. Whilst Big Mike and Mr. Winifred was getting ready to show, Uncle Melvin and Mr. Phelps sure enough had to think a heck of a lot to sponsor Big Mike and Ebony with his reputation on the line and all, plus the cost. Well, the boys didn't have no idea what all it cost, but it cost a pretty penny. Just the entry fee alone. Well, the boys didn't have no idea what it cost, like I say, but they had faith in Big Mike. When Big Mike was brought on out, him and Ebony sure enough put on a show. The boys didn't know Ebony could do all them gaits, and Big Mike really put him through his paces that day. Well, after all was said and done, Big Mike and Ebony come out with a first and second place and best in show. When Big Mike was asked how he come to show his horse, he said he owed it all to Mr. Phelps and Mr. Winifred of Claiborne Farms. Well, Mr. Winifred said they was just a natural and just knowed they would do well even though they never competed before. Took to it like a duck to water, he said. Well, Mr. Phelps stated that when he saw Big Mike's Ebony that he knowed good horse flesh when he seed it. Now, the reporter asked Mr. Phelps if he was going to into showing Tennessee walkers as well as racing his and thoroughbreds. Well, if all my horses was as good as Ebony, we would, but we would stick to racing, I reckon. Truth is, it raised up Mr. Phelps right smart in folks' eyes about him knowing good stock, and all of his prices for stud fees and horses sure would take a considerable jump because of Big Mike and Ebony. That wasn't the reason Mr. Phelps done it, though, Mr. Winifred. They knew good horse flesh, and they wanted to give that boy and that horse a shot. Well, Big Mike, him and Ebony was heading on back home and figured his show days was over. But it was sure enough fun and was glad for folks to see how good a horse Ebony was. Well, Big Mike, him and Ebony was heading on back home and was glad to be on the way. Everybody was wanting autographs and pictures and interviews when they got there, but Big Mike didn't like the limelight, left on back out to Aunt Gertrude with the boys. Well, after all the hullabaloo and commotion, Mr. Phelps took all the boys to Louisville to the Churchill Downs, where the Kentucky Derby was held. The boys enjoyed all the racing and eating and visiting with the folks, but when the announcer said Big Mike Young was there with Mr. Phelps, he turned red as a beet and was ready to skedaddle. Big Mike's kind of a humble kind of feller, you know. Well, Mr. Phelps kept all the boys safe and sound and away from all the press and just enjoyed the rest of the day. They all got in late that evening and hit the hay. The next morning, Aunt Gertrude said Roscoe called and said that Big Mike's truck was ready and come on by any time for it. The boys figured on leaving the next morning and began to getting ready. They was up early and after a mighty fine breakfast, said their goodbyes, headed on out there with Aunt Gertrude all teary-eyed and Uncle Melvin saying to come on back any time but to hurry on up. They had lots of hug-ems and shaking hands with Uncle Melvin too. Well, after leaving Aunt Gertrude's, the boys headed on over to Strawberry Hill outside of Mount Sterling to visit Aunt Judith and Elizabeth Jane and see if they needed any help around the place. The mansion and distillery could always use some tending to just like the farm. When Aunt Judith seen the boys a coming, she hollered for Elizabeth Jane and the McGregor ladies to come a running. Them women was a grinning and a tearing up to something awful, giving them hugs and kisses and carrying on like they ain't seen them for a month of Sundays. Well, Buster introduced Big Mike to everybody, and Aunt Judith took everybody to the parlor and gave them all a little old McBrayer to cut the dust from the trip. She and Elizabeth Jane wanted to know all the news all about the families. Well, Colleen and Maureen come in and sit a spell while supper was a-cooking and visited along with all the boys. They was family too, you know. Elizabeth Jane said she heard on the news about Big Mike and Ebony, and the story also told about the boys and Aunt Gertrude and Uncle Melvin. It was a right nice piece on all of them. She said the boys' folks called and said they was on the way and was planning on stopping by and visiting and lending a hand where needed for a spell. The supper was more'n a feller could eat and fit for a king, I tell you. There was fried chicken, hickory smoked sugar-cured ham, fried pork chops, pan-fried taters, one skillet just for Buster, fresh corn on the cob, fried okra, sliced maters, fresh-made rolls, triple yeast, hand-churned butter, green beans, turnip greens, milk gravy for dipping, sweet tater casserole with watermelon cantaloupe and pecan pie, and hand-turned vanilla ice cream. Well, the boy sure put on the feed bag, that's for sure. Big Mike asked Buster if they ate like that all the time. Buster just grinned and said, "Yep." Well, after supper, the boys asked Aunt Judith just what needed done around the place. She said she wanted the boys to look out at the distillery and see if they could get it running a bit better, because it didn't seem to be operating just right. Well, Big Mike volunteered to look at it, and Hired said he'd help him. Walter told her that he would ride the fence line on the gray and check on the farm. Well, Buster and Jesse would look at to the mansion and accounts with Aunt Judith and Elizabeth Jane. The boys stayed for the rest of the week and then left on out to Uncle Roscoe's, there in Tennessee. Well, Aunt Judith was a-hugging them all and a-crying, saying she was a-missing them something dearly already. Elizabeth Jane said she would call them when she decided to go back to school and maybe some of the folks could come for a spell. Well, all the boys said they would talk to the families and do just that. The boys hit the backside of Crossville and went on up to Uncle Roscoe's garage after they left on out to see about Big Mike's truck. Well, it was ready and raring to go. Uncle Roscoe called up Mamie and told her the boys was here and was a-staying for supper. Uncle Roscoe had a place out back for Ebony, and he went to grazing and resting up after the drive. Well, Ish come in later and was a-visiting with Buster and asked the boys if they'd wanted to see him race that night. Well, Hired was all for that, I tell you. Dirt track racing was right thrilling, and Cecil, that's Buster's very own first cousin, called him Ish, you know, was quite the driver and car builder, and him and Uncle Roscoe could sure enough build a car and a motor. Walter and Hire told Ish all about the horse races, about them winning a few dollars on Mr. Phelps's horses and all the fun they had. Cecil said, y'all ain't seen nothing yet till you go to one of the major NASCAR races and get in the pits. Them pit lizards everywhere down there. Big Mike said it don't seem like that would be much fun, and Cecil went to laughing. Pit lizards is the gals, he said. They go plumb bonkers for anybody in racing. Them with their fancy duds and diamonds and fur coats all around out there grease, they'll plumb run you to ground. Well, the boys all said their goodbyes and thanked Uncle Roscoe for fixing the truck. He said that's what families for, to help one another. Aunt Mamie is a sweetheart for sure, putting up with this brood. Well, Buster told the boys they was going to have to do something nice for the ladies soon. Well, when the boys got on back to the house, there was a brass band and a parade and the mayor giving a speech for them. Looking to be a real big deal about Big Mike, Ebony, and the boys. Reporters from the paper and TV station was there for interviews. Big Mike brung out Ebony and his and ribbons and showed his and horse off to the whole dang state. Of course, all the folks was there and was proud as punch of them all. But Big Mike's folks, there's Ma and Pa, they was grinning from ear to ear. And Miss Young had a little tear or two in her eye over that boy. Well, all the folks sped up to Jesse's house for all the family news and all the goings on with the boys and what they'd been into. Well, Jesse said the trip was a mite longer than they expected, but well worth it. Well, Buster told all the folks they had to be sure to look in on Aunt Judith and Aunt Gertrude and the rest of the folks real soon. They was pining for 'em. Wasn't long after that, Buster got a scrapbook from Aunt Judith and Aunt Gertrude for Big Mike telling them all about him and Ebony and his winning best in show. It also seemed Ebony was going to be a paw pretty soon, as he and one of the thoroughbred mares on the farm was going to have a foal. Reckon Big Mike better get ready to train up another winner for the family. This time it'll be running for the roses. Well, that's a heck of a tale, folks. Hope y'all enjoyed it. Y'all have a blessed day. See you next week.